Good afternoon and Assalamu alaikum. On the behalf of Center for Private Sector Engagement, STPI, I am Mahin Rehan. Welcome you all to today's webinar titled Cross-Border Trade Through Micro Enterprises and Startups. Before we start off with today's session, there are a few housekeeping rules. May I please request our speakers to keep their microphones off when they are not speaking to ensure good audio quality for everyone. Speakers are also encouraged to switch their cameras, especially when they are speaking, if their network allowed to do so, that without any disruption. The webinar will be recorded and shared later for your kind reference. You are welcome to revisit the discussion later and feel free to share it with your network. We also invite questions from our audience and colleagues at the end or as the session goes. Please feel free to write them in the chat box or in the Q&A box on the right side. Please have chat box open in the window as well, or you can also indicate that you want to speak by clicking the raise hand tab on the right side of the chat window. The session is bilingual and you may speak in both Urdu and English language as per your convenience. Today's session is moderated by Ms. Zainab Mumtaz Baloch, Project Assistant, Center for Private Engagement, SDPI. Now I hand over the session to her so we may begin with the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahin, for sharing with us the housekeeping rules. So today we have been joined by Mr. Shahryar Tahir, Deputy General Manager, Head of External Relations at Sameda, and Dr. Adil Nakhoda, Assistant Professor, Institute of Business Administration, Karachi, Mr. Talha Leghari, who will be joining us shortly, subject matter expert for DFS and FinTech, and he's working as a consultant with international development agencies like GIZ and Karamdas. And we have been joined by Mr. Ahmed Awais Khawat, who is Research Associate at STPI. And the very esteemed panelists, we have Mr. Shayan Jar, who is Head of Global Partnerships at National Incubation Center. Moving forward, I thank and welcome all my esteemed panelists in the webinar, and to build the background of our discussion today on the topic cross-border trade through micro enterprises and startups. I'd say that micro enterprises and startups are those small-scale businesses that are operating with limited resources, but with their own unique business strategies. Despite the economic shocks given by the global pandemic, COVID-19, or the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Pakistan has showed its massive potential in boosting the economy with the help of this particular sector, that is micro enterprises and startups. And according to the Startup Ecosystem Report, 2022, Pakistan has been ranked 76 globally and second in the South Asian region in the global startup ecosystem. And in order to fully utilize this potential that the sector owes, it has and as the progress that has showed over the period of time, government of Pakistan has been launching different initiatives, and it has taken a few initiatives like the National SMEs Policy 2021 to help smaller businesses expand in the international market. While we see the national and international investors who have started investing into the small scale businesses to increase the diversity and to bring different business models in the market. Keeping in view all these multiple opportunities and initiatives that we have, the micro enterprises and startups are still facing multiple challenges and barriers that are hindering their growth, not only in increasing their market value, but in the demand side as well. For instance, the problems that we see are in logistics, infrastructure, and operational problems. While all these problems stand on one side, we see that for women, this overall system becomes even more difficult due to the socio-cultural barriers in our country. All of these aforementioned issues are a result of political instability, the risk of default, the rupee degradation, skyrocketing inflation, and the revival of terrorism in the country for sure. So today's discussion is about addressing how and what should be done in creating a better startup ecosystem in the country, what should be done for this sector in particular, and to address the challenges and find their solutions if possible. This context, I'd like to move towards Mr. Ahmed Awais Khawat. Sir, if you could please share your insights on what are the potential sectors that are currently operational and new micro enterprises and startups that can play an essential role in the economic growth and development of Pakistan. And if you could please share that are there any particular policy interventions or reforms that have been proven effective in facilitating cross-border trade?
Thank you very much, Zainab. I hope you can clearly hear me. Okay.
I'm going to be talking about two major policy interventions that have been made over the years with the idea of promoting exports of um small, medium, and micro enterprises. And those two themes necessarily are around tariff rationalization and how they impact MSMEs. And secondly, the export facilitation schemes offered by FBR. So to start off with, I think I will first briefly talk about the tariff rationalization scheme and then move towards the export facilitation scheme. We have produced two policy briefs on both of these themes, which I will also be sharing in the chat box if anybody wants to go into further detail. I do understand that we have a limited time, so I will just talk about 3 or 4 very fundamental key findings from our research that we did last year. So the national tariff policy was announced in 2019 for 2019 to 2024 with 3 major objectives. One was to remove tariff-related anomalies in the short term. The second was to increase employment generation, and the third was to gain competitiveness and exports in the long term. We surveyed about 300 different firms in KP, Punjab, and Sindh. And those industries were from the garment sector, the auto parts, agro and food processing, leather sector, surgical instruments, engineering goods, sports goods, iron and steel, chemicals, and plastics. So one of the fundamental things was the awareness around the national tariff policy and how many of the firms actually were aware of the policy and how many understood the dynamics and the access to it. So we found out that about 55% of the firms that we surveyed were aware of the policy, and 45% of them were not aware of the policy. The ones that were aware of the policy do acknowledge that access to the tariff code has increased since announcement of the policy. And they also note that the policy is beneficial for their business and overall policy certainty, especially in agriculture and manufacturing sectors. Secondly, the policy essentially looks at the customs and regulatory duty. However, over 50% of the firms claimed that customs duty on the main input did not change at all. Similarly, with regards to regulatory duty, a large majority of industries, except the leather and engineering goods, mentioned no change in regulatory duty as well. The third thing is policy coherence. If you look at the auto manufacturers, they suggest that they face around 15 to 20% customs duty, the auto manufacturers. But we also have to keep in mind that these duties may be an outcome of the auto policy and not the tariff policy itself. So there are other variables also that come into play. It's not just a singular policy intervention that results in such higher customs duty. Then you have a problem with regards to HS codes, for instance, in case of the air compressors for auto manufacturers. There has been a constant shift in the tariff slabs, and there has been shift in the HS codes as well, which leads to confusion, which leads to constant reassessments at firm level, and you cannot engage in forward planning. Fifth thing, I think, most important is that post COVID-19, especially the agro industry responded that the tariff policy should respond to changes in global economic environment, and suggested that their access to global markets had reduced due to pandemic. Now, if you look deeply into it, for instance, rice exporters, now it was essential post COVID-19 to use fumigated bags to allow air to pass through them because of enhanced protocols. But it was not a direct in relation to the tariff policy. So rates on such inputs, including packaging materials, should also be looked into. So these were the basic ideas or basic themes around what the government has been doing and how it has impacted MSMEs in terms of tariff rationalizations. I will be sharing the policy brief if anybody wants to go into deeper detail. In terms of specifically looking at tariff rationalization, I think the National Tariff Commission may want to institutionalize and increase its interaction with the business community, because as the survey tells us that about 45% of the firms were not aware of the existence of the policy itself. A more adaptive design of future tariff policies needs to be looked into. For instance, as COVID-19 came in, you have these 2022 floods, you have changing global environment, a lot of things are going on. So in the adaptive design for future tariff policies is something that needs to be looked into. Public-private dialogues on tariff reforms with small chambers of commerce and industry. Usually we look at very specific certain names that do come into these public-private dialogues. I think we need to diversify, we need to go beyond those larger organizations or heads of different federations. We need to reach out to a wider audience in that, especially in the rural settings. NTC may also like to initiate data sharing agreements with key associations such as Pakistan Business Council, the Federal Chamber of Commerce as well, so that the impact of tariff changes might be analyzed more frequently. I'm just going to look at some of the numbers for the, so that's one part of it. And this is parked at the Ministry of Commerce under the National Tariff Commission. Now we move to the Federal Board of Revenue and look at how its policy interventions have affected, or what are the areas where we need some improvements, or we suggest that some recommendations that might help designing policies in the future. So multiple export facilitation schemes exist in Pakistan. The latest one was initiated in 2021. It is called the Export Facilitation Scheme 2021. So the idea for this survey was to go and meet firms and to assess what loopholes, bottlenecks, challenges were there in existing export facilitation schemes, because the idea was to phase out other three major export facilitation schemes and to just keep the export facilitation scheme in place by August 2023, more precisely the end of 2023. So the idea was to go to the firms, sift through the debris of information available and look for those recommendations or those high points of existing facilitation schemes and feed them into the new export facilitation scheme. These multiple facilitation schemes vary significantly in eligibility, validity, utilization period, the audit requirements, the domestic sale and purchase, among others. But the crux or the gist of these schemes is to expand export volume. Number two, simplified documentation and a reduction in input costs. A similar methodology, as I mentioned, for the previous study was conducted with 300 firms across different sectors. By 2022, the four schemes that we analyzed for this survey were duty and tax remission for exports, which I will be calling DTRE for the discussion, the manufacturing bond, export-oriented unit, and the export facilitation scheme. So these four schemes by 2022, FBR's data suggested that over 95% of all active exporters were availing these four schemes. So now to look at what this means for MSMEs and how it impacts them, or where do we need to make changes is 2/5 of all respondents use DTRE, duty and tax remission for export schemes. They feel satisfied with it largely, but they deem that the cost of accessing the scheme is on the higher side. There is some growth in export volumes and some reduction in input and compliance cost. However, with an increase or a rather large increase in other trade costs offsets these very small gains in export and cost minimization. Pakistan's single window, there were discussions around how during the design and planning phase for the Pakistan single window could have been more inclusive. the private sector could have had a more buy-in if they were on board from the very word go and could have provided their own input. So the idea is that by the time the PSW was rolled out, exporters, forwarders, banks, they found themselves, let's say, in a hurry or in a helter-skelter way, trying to find out what needs to be done and how to access it and what is the proper procedure to deal with PSW. So there was this confusion with regards to Pakistan single window. So if you look at specifically how these facilitation schemes respond to in terms of cost minimization, 50%, more than 50% of respondents said that the cost minimization was below 10%. A similar pattern of cost minimization of less than 10% was observed across export schemes. It's so minimal or so insignificant that in front of the volatile currency value and the changes in tariffs and duties, it's not even worth talking about. That's the idea that the firms provide when you talk about the actual impact of these facilitation schemes to them. So majorly, they believe that there's a selection bias in favor of large industries because the criteria of availing these schemes is tough. Now, the criteria, as I mentioned, it is different for audit requirements, for local sale and purchase, in terms of having a warehouse, in terms of getting the raw material. Of course, a working capital that is required to ensure that you get the raw material and then you actually go through the whole process of export is significant. I think the next point that I'm going to be sharing here is something that we come across in literature, we come across in any discussion that we have with the private sector, and it's about refunds. 80% of the respondents in the sample reported facing significant delays in receiving tax refunds at import stage. Again, as I mentioned, that when you're talking about below 10% gains in terms of accessing these schemes, when you have these very long and tedious processes of getting back those import stage tax refunds, all of this less than 10% gain that you have acquired seems to just fade away in front of such long delays. So what we suggest essentially here is that we need to look into sector-based studies exploring how delays in funds have impacted the competitiveness of Pakistan's exporting sectors over the years. We believe that the upcoming EFS, that will be the only facilitation scheme available to exporters, again needs to have in mind what went wrong with existing facilitation schemes and what needs to further improve. We need to understand that this whole environment or the whole ecosystem for exporter needs to be looked into with regards to the FBR, the NTC, the State Bank. You have to have that whole environment that comes into play. You cannot look at specific organizations or specific policies and then come up with an idea for a certain policy. We believe that an annual assessment of the export facilitation schemes should be conducted, published, and discussed with industry. The learning can provide important corrective measures for the next round of improvements to the design and delivery of EFS. I have been in contact with FBR. There have been some improvements. For instance, now the indirect, you have some facilitation for the indirect exporter, the people who kind of do not import directly the raw material, but buy it locally and then export. But of course, likewise, some other developments are being made, but we need to look into them that if they have actually got us any desired results. But there are changes being made. In the coming years, I'm sure they will come to fore. So this is from my side. I will be happy to respond to any questions, and I will share the link to both the files in the comment section. It's back to you. Thank you.
Very rightly pointed, sir. That there is a lack of awareness in the overall system on behalf of either if it's PSW, Pakistan single window, or if it's about the the SMEs policies that have been taken, the initiatives that have been taken by the government. And also there is a dire need to look into particular sectors and try to address those delays that are causing or that are hindering the growth of the export competitiveness of Pakistan. And we need to look into it. Thank you so much, sir, for your insightful interventions. Now I'd like to move towards Dr. Adil. Sir, what are some of the main challenges faced by micro enterprises and startups in cross-border trade? And from a policy perspective, if we see, what are some of the key considerations that governments and policymakers should take into account to promote and support cross-border trade for micro enterprises and startups? Over to you, sir.
Okay, so first I would like to thank SDPI for the invitation. Okay, so this is, I believe, is a crucial topic, right? Particularly given that the lack of participation in international trading activities is one of the biggest concerns for Pakistani policymakers, businesses, and academics alike. Before I begin my discussion on this topic, I would like to state that, so let's start with this discussion on exports, which as a percentage of GDP for Pakistan has declined considerably since mid-2000s. It's basically dropped to 8.2% in 2017. On the other hand, the average for the South Asian economies peaked at 23.6% in 2013, but dropped to 19% in 2019. So we saw a slight decline, but it is still, the other South Asian economies are performing way better in terms of exports as a percent of GDP. They've opened their economy much more than what we have, right? So in the 1990s, Pakistan was reporting much higher values than the South Asian counterparts. So the question comes up is, what went wrong? While the other economies in the South Asian region increased their participation in exporting activities, Pakistan's declined, and the stagnation of exports is a major reason for the recurring balance of payment crisis for Pakistan. As highlighted, the lack of participation of SMEs, international trading activities, has contributed to this consistent deterioration of the exporting capabilities of all Pakistani industries. So for this discussion, I will focus on two studies. One of them is the recent survey data set released by the World Bank Enterprise Survey on Pakistani firms. They conducted a survey in 2022, and they have just released the data last month. And the other is my collaboration with SDPI, titled Micro, Small and Medium Enterprises Amid Crisis Times, Lessons from Pandemic Experience in Pakistan. So one of the good things about the World Bank Enterprise Surveys, which I'm also going to refer to, is that allows for cross comparison with our regional counterpart, India. So let's consider the participation of smaller firms in international trading activities. The World Bank Enterprise Surveys highlights the challenges that smaller firms face when trading. The study finds that less than 3% of the smaller firms with fewer than 20 employees export. Similarly, more than 30% of the larger firms, which have more than 100 employees, export. Right, so smaller firms are more likely to import than export. We also see that as 10% of the smaller firms import in Pakistan in comparison to more than 30% of the larger firms. So smaller firms, yes, in essence, don't export or import as much, but when it comes to importing, they import more than they export, right? So however, it is important to state that only 5% of the smaller firms that import their inputs also export their output in comparison to almost 50% of the larger firms do so. So one more thing that is important here to specify is that a lot of these smaller firms that are importing aren't exporting their output. So as we see that there's a lot of local market bias, and that is much more strongly pervasive amongst the smaller firms. So in a sense, export participation is rather elusive for the smaller firms, as the participation in exporting activities is almost negligible. In comparison, 6% of the smaller firms export in India, 3% of the smaller firms import, while about 38% of the importing firms export. So the smaller importing firms in India are more likely to be two-way traders than Pakistani firms. Pakistani SMEs that import are likely to be less global than their India counterparts and more inward-looking. This could suggest that SMEs in Pakistan have access to not only fewer domestic resources, but importing firms sell locally. So we see that Indian firms, even though the smaller firms are not maybe as open to trade, but when they do import, they convert those inputs into exportable output more than what our smaller firms in Pakistan do. So according to the SDPI study, firms undertaking cross-border trade are more likely to be located in Punjab and Sindh, with a few exceptions for firms belonging to the transport sector in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. So larger and more established firms are likely to undertake cross-border trade than the smaller counterparts, which is again consistent to the findings reported in the World Bank Enterprise Service. Now, the World Bank Enterprise Service also reports that more than all of these smaller exporting firms in Pakistan find customs and regulations to be either a major or very severe obstacle to trade. And this amount, like the percentage of firms, is about 50% for those who find this to be severe or major obstacle to trade. So comparatively, a much lower percentage of exporting firms in India report customs and trade regulations to be either a major obstacle or a severe obstacle to trade, with majority reporting customs and regulations either as no obstacles or minor obstacles to trade. So one of the biggest obstacles to firm growth and development highlighted in World Bank Enterprise Service is access to finance. So according to the recent survey, it is the biggest obstacle for firm growth after political instability and corruption for all firms in Pakistan. It is the second biggest obstacle for smaller firms after political instability. However, the access remains poor, with only a negligible number of firms accessing finance from financial institutions. A larger percentage of firms have applied for loans in India, while access to finance remains the biggest obstacle, followed by tax rates, competition from informal firms, and customs and trade regulations in India. Political instability and corruption rank relatively lower as obstacles in India. Now, in the SDPI study, we also highlighted that the cost of logistics and timeliness of shipment was a big obstacle. Given that the study was conducted during COVID times, these obstacles are relevant. And it is the younger firms that report these greater burden from such obstacles than the more established counterparts. So firm experience seems to play a role in maneuvering the challenges in cross-border trade. So when it comes to trade documentation, the biggest concern was a change in regulatory documents as rules and regulations evolved during the pandemic times. Now, the female participation, so when we talk about female participation, small firms tend to have a smaller proportion of female employees than the larger counterparts, as again reported in World Bank Enterprise Service. Larger firms also provide more opportunities for females to work in top management than smaller firms. Unfortunately, the presence of female employees in exporting firms seems to be limited. This seems to be a similar trend in India as well, although the participation of female employees in exporting firms is relatively better in India. So according to the SDPI study, a higher proportion of female-led business demanded relief in electricity and gas bills, as well as temporary relief in rental payments to support their businesses during COVID than male-led businesses. They found SBP's finance schemes and loan deferral payments to be least effective, indicating lack of access to finance and challenges to access financial markets, particularly for the female-led businesses. Further, female-led businesses were more likely to tap into their own savings during challenges than male-led businesses. So now let me come to the recommendations. So the recommendations to improve participation of small businesses cross-border trade include better digitalization of services provided to traders through online registrations, opportunities to conduct online exhibitions and seminars, as well as having access to training programs, improvement in access to finance to SMEs, better awareness of government facilitation programs, and better opportunities for SMEs in non-traditional and creative industries. So one thing we see is that the non-traditional and creative industries tend to be highly neglected when it comes to for the government facilitation programs. The opportunities must not only increase their consumer reach, but also create networks within themselves to benefit from spillover effects as the industry grows. Further, improving consumer awareness on the quality and the characteristics of their output can persuade them to buy products sold by formal businesses that are invested in quality rather than purchase low quality smuggled goods or from the informal market. So the idea is to provide opportunities for formal businesses to invest in quality and products from the informal businesses and the businesses that produce in the gray market, right? So we need to differentiate that so that the formal businesses, which again is a much smaller percentage, there's a large informal SMEs that tend to take the space, and then there is this whole problem with documentation, etc. Competition from informal businesses that is naturally taking a large chunk of the market. So better digitalization should not only involve improvement in internet. internet in the infrastructure across the country, but also facilitates small businesses to participate in e-commerce and online as well as virtual trade fairs and exhibitions to sell their products abroad. Improvement in finance to SMEs should involve increasing access to finance, particularly for smaller and women-led businesses that are often locked out due to uncompetitive interest rates and less attractive financial terms for the lenders. Trade-related concessions such as favorable payment terms and support from different stakeholders can aid businesses' activities of smaller firms. Government facilitation must include raising awareness of regulations, certifications, as well as conformity assessments for smaller businesses so that they can target specific markets for their products without the risk of failing import quality checks and measures at the border of their trading partner. Further, awareness should include training programs that can reduce information asymmetries across businesses. Lastly, it is essential to pursue agreements with our trading partners that include provisions on SMEs. So almost all recently concluded FTAs include a provision on encouraging the participation of SMEs in trading activities by specifically listing measures for SMEs. Both EU and ASEAN are at the forefront of including such provisions. These provisions include cooperation between SMEs and partner countries, exemption from certain obligations and restrictions, importance of trade facilitation for SMEs, reduction in trade-related costs for SMEs, as well as excluding certain subsidies to SMEs from trade restrictions and creating institutional arrangements specifically designed for SMEs. Unfortunately, the FTA between Pakistan and China does not take into account the role of SMEs. And well, Pakistan's FTAs have not taken that into account as much, right? So our FTAs, the negotiation and the agreements that we have done are kind of outdated because a lot of these agreements we see with this development of these broader regional agreements, we see them being included as well, like RCEP, etc. So even when it comes to the provision of market access for Pakistani goods into the Chinese market, the beneficiaries are likely to be larger businesses rather than SMEs. The SMEs, particularly those in the less traditional sector, remain neglected. So in essence, SMEs can have a major role in not only creating employment opportunities, but also increasing the level of exports from Pakistan. The current structure of incentives often favors the larger firms, reducing opportunities for SMEs to grow. The policy landscape must become more inclusive for SMEs. And with that, I conclude. Thank you. Ji.
Thank you, sir. You have correctly stressed on the point that there are many obstacles like political instability, logistics, and access to finance, a major reason of hampering the growth of startups and micro enterprises. And also, there is a dire need to focus on the regulatory processes that we have now in our system. And now, moving forward, I'd like to move towards Mr. Shayan. If you would please, highlight that how does the NIC, the National Incubation Center, it provide opportunities to the startups in terms of guidance and mentoring. Because the role of mentoring is very, very important when it comes to the smaller businesses and the entrepreneurs. And how do you facilitate collaborations and partnerships within the startup ecosystem? And if you could please share what are the initiatives taken by the government for the startups and what can be done for the overall growth and development of the local startup system. Over to you, sir.
Zainab, thank you. I'm going to start with a brief context of what has been talked about by the previous two speakers. I want to contribute majorly the topic of their discussion and the things that they have highlighted have been through the lens of, I think, the micro enterprises, the conventional enterprises in Pakistan, whereas startups, I think, were absent from that particular narrative. So let me first make up for that. I think हम लोग जब बात करते हैं ना 75 years से, if we look at what has been happening in Pakistan in order to give subsidies to different sectors, in order to create a more outward oriented or export oriented industry in Pakistan, हर जगह पे the consultations have been done with the micro and small enterprises, MSMEs वगैरह के साथ. And there is a fundamental difference. So for everybody's benefit, the enterprises or the conventional businesses are fundamentally different from what we call startups. Startups are naturally first technology oriented, and because of the very nature that they have technology at their core, they are disruptive and exponentially grow within the time period, like very small time period compared to the conventional enterprises. So this being the difference, had we focused more on converting ourselves, upgrading ourselves from just the micro and small enterprises and giving and focusing all the subsidies towards them, focusing all our policies towards them, I think it would have been much, much better exercise if we had considered the startups in this as well. They have been vehemently ignored, and that is why we are where we are. Considering the size of the market that we have, there is not a single startup in Pakistan that has reached $250 million mark right now, which is shameful, because for an ecosystem of our size, I think to have this sort of valuation, undervaluation, I would say, there is no excuse. So पहले तो हम लोगों को अपनी प्रायोरिटीज ठीक करनी होंगी ऑन गवर्नमेंट लेवल. मुशर्रफ के दौर में आई रिमेंबर देयर वाज अ फोकस एंड आइडेंटिफिकेशन फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल दैट पाकिस्तान हैज टू बी अ सर्विस ओरिएंटेड मार्केट. हम लोगों को जो बार बार बैलेंस ऑफ पेमेंट का इशू आता है, बार बार जो हमारे ये फंडामेंटल्स ऑफ इकोनॉमिक्स जो है वो बार बार खराब हो जाते हैं, उसकी बड़ी वजह ये है कि आपके पास ना कोई यहाँ पर रॉ मटेरियल है, ना आपके पास टेक्नोलॉजी है, ना आपके पास जो है वो कोई स्किल्ड लेबर है, और आप बार बार पाकिस्तान के अंदर मैन्युफैक्चरिंग सेक्टर को लगाने की कोशिश करते हैं. फिर आप जो है वो सब्सिडीज देते हैं अपनी टेक्सटाइल सेक्टर को, फिर आप सब्सिडीज देते हैं अपने क्या कहते हैं बाकी के जो मैन्युफैक्चरिंग सेक्टर्स हैं ऑटोमोबाइल समेत उनको, और इतनी बड़ी बड़ी इन्वेस्टमेंट उनमें से होती हैं. एंड नाउ सी व्हाट इज हैपनिंग. पाकिस्तान से कभी सुजुकी बाहर जा रही है, कभी होंडा अपनी प्रोडक्शन बंद कर रही है. So this could have been saved, the entire embarrassment could have been saved had we focused just on the strength that Pakistan had, which was the service sector of Pakistan. That includes technology and especially includes technology. I think this is where the startups and companies in technology sector come in. They would have no import bills coming into Pakistan, जिसकी वजह से आपका balance of payment बिल्कुल ठीक रहता है और आपको एक्सपोर्ट बहुत ज्यादा मिलती है. फॉर एग्जांपल पाकिस्तान की सिंगल बिगेस्ट जो अभी आपको एक्सपोर्ट नजर आएगी वो सिस्टम्स लिमिटेड की है. अगर आप उनका जो वो है कंट्रीब्यूशन टू द एक्सपोर्ट सेक्टर वो आप देखेंगे कितना वो पैसा कमा के लेके आ रहे हैं पाकिस्तान में, वो आपको नजर आ जाएगा कि बाकी सेक्टर्स क्या कर रहे हैं और आपका ये सेक्टर क्या कर रहा है. सो आई थिंक पहले तो ये आइडेंटिफिकेशन होने की जरूरत है कि हम लोगों की फोर्टे क्या है, हम लोगों को किस चीज के ऊपर फोकस करना है गोइंग फॉरवर्ड, एंड दैट हैज टू बी द सर्विस सेक्टर, द टेक्नोलॉजी सेक्टर ऑफ पाकिस्तान. स्टॉप प्रोवाइडिंग सब्सिडीज टुवर्ड्स द रॉन्ग सेक्टर्स, क्योंकि हमेशा आप जब इन चीजों के ऊपर जाके फोकस करेंगे, दीज हैव बीन ईटिंग इनटू आवर जीडीपी, दे हैव बीन ईटिंग इनटू आवर एक्सपेंसेस, and they have done nothing but taken subsidy and have not added anything to our export sector. So I think it's a failed method. We keep trying it again and again with no results. Second, अब जो आपने मेरे से सवाल किया, I think government ने बहुत 2016 के बाद बहुत सारे steps लिए हैं. One of them was national incubation centers का क़याम, establishment of them, and not just in Islamabad. They have rapidly expanded them to 8 major cities, tier 2 cities और tier 3 cities के अंदर भी expand होने की बात हो रही है. इसी की तरह फिर जो है वो गवर्नमेंट ऑफ पंजाब ने भी साथ ही जो है वो अपने incubation centers को expand करना शुरू किया under Plan X and Plan 9. So these efforts have produced some good results. I think पाकिस्तान का जो startup ecosystem है in these 7 years and especially after 2019, it has emerged on the global map, और अब 76 हम लोग rank करते हैं. Again, this is nowhere near the true potential of Pakistan, given the size of the market, given the number of people that we have trained from the highest quality universities around the world, and they have come back to Pakistan to work in the economy. I think this could have been much, much better had the focus been on the technology sector and the startup sector. So, for example, अभी जितनी भी बातें हो रही थी ये क्या कहते हैं FBR के हवाले से या SECT के हवाले से, इनके अंदर से कोई एक कंसल्टेशन ऐसी नहीं है. हमने 2019 के अंदर एक इन्वेस्टर राउंड टेबल करवाना शुरू की थी, जिसमें हमने इन सारे के सारे पॉलिसी मेकिंग इंस्टीट्यूशंस को भी बुलाना शुरू किया. तो साथ में वी गॉट द VCs, the investors and the startups, major startups from the country on one table to discuss what are the problems, और फिर हम उसमें से white paper निकाल के उनको follow up भी करते थे, what are the policy actions that have been promised and are those policy actions then been converted into action? So yes, there are some efforts that are going towards that, but अभी भी largely जो government की side से इन चीजों की तरफ effort है वो नहीं है. So एक बहुत बड़ा हमें जो मसला नजर आता है वो ये है कि FDR हर दफा जो है वो कमिट कर देगा कि फॉर एग्जांपल आपका जो स्टार्टअप है इसके ऊपर 3 साल तक कोई किसी किस्म की जो है वो टैक्सेशन नहीं होगी, बट उसकी फिर एक्चुअल इम्प्लीमेंटेशन कभी भी नहीं होती है. फिर उनको 6 महीने के बाद पता चल रहा होता है कि IMF ने कहीं पे इंटरवीन कर दिया, IMF को ये पॉलिसी पसंद नहीं आई या किसी भी वजह से, और आपको ये टैक्सेशन देनी ही देनी है. सेकेंडली, अभी हमारा एक बहुत अच्छा स्टार्टअप है, मैं आपको एग्जांपल्स दे के अब यहाँ पे जो है वो बातें वाज़ेह करूंगा ताकि दिस डज नॉट सीम लाइक दिस इज समथिंग इन द एयर. तो हमारा एक बहुत अच्छा स्टार्टअप है, उसका नाम है दतीनी फाइबर्स. लंडे के जो कपड़े होते हैं, यूज कपड़े, उनको इंपोर्ट करता था दूसरे ममालिक से, और H&M इनका एक बहुत बड़ा ग्लोबल ब्रांड है, वो इनका क्लाइंट था. उन्होंने इनको $500,000 की जो इनिशियल इन्वेस्टमेंट चाहिए थी इन टर्म्स ऑफ मशीनरी वो दी उन्होंने, और पाकिस्तान में बैठ के ये एक ऐसा फाइबर बना रहे थे जो कि पेटेंटेड था, और ये उन कपड़ों से रिसाइकिल करके जो है वो फाइबर बना रहे थे जो कि H&M अपने बाकी कपड़ों में इस्तेमाल करता था, reducing their क्या कहते हैं carbon footprint and making them more environment friendly. So they had an amazing business going on, $1.5 million एक साल के अंदर for a very small startup जो कि पिछले साल में स्टार्ट हुआ था, एक साल में to reach $1.5 million in revenue without any external investment is amazing for Pakistani market. बहुत कम ऐसे स्टार्टअप्स हैं पाकिस्तान में जो इतनी एक्सपोनेंशियल ग्रोथ दिखाते हैं. लेकिन उनके साथ क्या हुआ, आपने पाकिस्तानी गवर्नमेंट ने लंडे के ऊपर भी जो है वो टैक्स लगाए. फिर जब भी FDR को रीच आउट किया गया कि भाई आप ये टैक्सेशन इस तरह से कर रहे हैं, उसकी वजह से उनको कैश फ्लो के अंदर प्रॉब्लम आ रही है, तो वो ये कहते थे कि जी ये अगर एक्सपोर्ट ओरिएंटेड है तो इनकी तो ये चीजें वापस हो जाएंगी, जो इनको ड्यूटी चार्ज हो रही है ये उसको कैश बैक कर सकते हैं. लेकिन अभी जिस तरह मेरे ख्याल में अहमद अवैस साहब बता रहे थे कि देयर आर मैसिव डिलेज इन दोज रीफंड्स, और उसकी वजह से अगर आप एक स्मॉल स्टार्टअप के हवाले से सोचें, उनके पास इस किस्म के कैश फ्लोज नहीं होते हैं कि वो 12 महीने तक जो है वो एक मैसिव अमाउंट जो है आपको पहले ड्यूटी के तौर पे दे दें और फिर उसके रिफंड का भी करते रहे. इन द मीन वाइल उनको एक और जो है वो खपत मंगानी है बाहर से, एक और खेप मंगानी है, और फिर उनको जो है वो उसको भी प्रोसेस करना है. तो उनके कैश फ्लो के प्रॉब्लम्स होते हैं, एंड इट किल्स द स्टार्टअप. एंड फॉर दिस वेरी रीजन दे हैड टू मूव टू दुबई, और उनको अपना सारे का सारा ऑपरेशन जो है वो दुबई में करना पड़ा. सो विच टेल्स अस कि कितना जो है वो बड़ा प्रॉब्लम है. इसी तरह से हर चीज के ऊपर हम लोगों ने इतनी शदीद किस्म की रेगुलेशन की हुई है और ओवर रेगुलेट किया हुआ है हर चीज को, एंड स्पेशली द फिनटेक सेक्टर. सो हमारा एक OG पे एक स्टार्टअप है, बाहर से पैसों का वैसे ही हमें मसला बनाया जाता है, लेकिन जो पाकिस्तान में पैसे लेके आना चाहते हैं उनके लिए भी हम मसाइल पूरे खड़े करते हैं. सो ये स्टार्टअप जो है वो रेमिटेंसेस पाकिस्तान में लेके आना चाहता था. इनका ऑलरेडी बिजनेस UK के अंदर है, विच इज अ ह्यूज फाइनेंशियल मार्केट, हमारे से बहुत आगे है फाइनेंशियली वो, और अपने सिस्टम्स में भी बहुत रोबस्ट है. UAE में भी इस्टेब्लिश है, अगेन सम मार्केट विच इज फाइनेंशियली मच मोर रोबस्ट देन पाकिस्तान. उन दोनों मार्केट में परफॉर्म करने के बावजूद ये 3 साल से लाइसेंस के लिए अप्लाई करके बैठे हुए हैं. 20 करोड़ रुपए स्टेट बैंक ऑफ पाकिस्तान ने इनसे लाइसेंसिंग फी ली हुई है. 3 साल से सारे के सारे डॉक्यूमेंट्स प्रोवाइड कर चुके हैं जो कि उनकी इनिशियल चेकलिस्ट के अंदर आए थे. उसके बाद 2 दफा इनको अलहदा से जो है वो एडिशनल चीजें कही जा चुकी हैं कि ये चीजें प्रोवाइड करें, वो भी प्रोवाइड कर दी हैं, एंड टू दिस डेट दे हैव नॉट बीन इशूड द लाइसेंस. 20 करोड़ रुपए जो 3 साल पहले उन्होंने उसको रखवाए थे, आज उसकी वैल्यू 1/3 भी नहीं रह गई, एंड देयर इज नो काइबोर पेमेंट फॉर देम, देयर इज नो एडजस्टमेंट ऑफ डिफ्लेशन फॉर देम. सो आप किस तरह से एक्सपेक्ट करते हैं कि इन सारी की सारी चीजों के होते हुए हम पाकिस्तान के अंदर स्टार्टअप को इनकरेज कर पाएंगे या उनके मसाइल को हल कर पाएंगे, जब आपने अपने प्रोसीजर्स को एक तो इतना ओवर रेगुलेट किया हुआ है. व्हाई डज अ स्टार्टअप नीड टू हैव अ लाइसेंस? इनको सारों को, मैं सिडनी में था, कोई भी स्टार्टअप फिनटेक सेक्टर के अंदर अगर वो शुरू कर रहा होता था, वो द स्टैंडर्ड प्रोसीजर, आप जब SECB में अपने आप को रजिस्टर करवाते हैं उसके बाद यू गेट अ ब्रैकेट के अगर आप इतनी वैल्यूएशन या इतनी वॉल्यूम ऑफ ट्रांजैक्शन तक डील नहीं कर रहे, उससे नीचे रहते हुए देयर इज अ सैंड बॉक्स जो कि अब SECB ने भी शुरू किया है, लेकिन उसकी बहुत क्लियर डेफिनेशन नहीं है और उसके लिए अलग से एप्लीकेशन प्रोसेस है, सब कुछ है. तो उसको आपको ऑटोमेट करना चाहिए कि आप अगर इतने वॉल्यूम से नीचे हैं तो ऑटोमेटिकली यू आर ऑपरेटिंग इन सैंडबॉक्स, यू डोंट नीड टू बाय अ लाइसेंस टू डिलीवर दोज सर्विसेज। तो हम पहले ही दिन से उनको इस भेड़ चाल में लगा देते हैं कि आप जाके लाइसेंस खरीदे, इतनी बड़ी बड़ी फी दे। पहले तो वो फी आएगी कहाँ से, दूसरा हम जो है वो जब वो फी ले भी लेते हैं तो देर इज नो सेट पीरियड के जिसके अंदर हमने उस लाइसेंस को डिलीवर करना है। तो इस तरह के मसाइल हैं। अब NIC अपनी तरफ से हर किस्म की एक्सपर्टीज प्रोवाइड करता है। आपको एक आइडिया लेके आए हैं, आपको अगर उसमें गो टू मार्केट का कोई जो है वो पता नहीं है, किस तरह से मैंने मार्केट में उस आइडिया को डिप्लॉय करना है, मैंने किस तरह से अपने कस्टमर्स को रीच करना है, मैंने आइडेंटिफाई किस तरह से करना है कि नई मार्केट क्या है, मुझे पार्टनरशिप्स बनानी है अपनी, ऐसी स्ट्रेटेजिक पार्टनरशिप्स जिससे मेरी सेल्स ज्यादा हो सके। डोमेन एक्सपर्ट्स की जरूरत है मुझे टू फाइंड आउट कि मेरी स्ट्रेटेजी क्या होनी चाहिए और मैं किस तरह से आगे बढ़ूँ। इसके अलावा रिसर्च एंड डेवलपमेंट के आपको कोई बहुत पर्टिकुलर जो है वो सवालात आ रहे हैं तो हम आपको पूरी दुनिया से, ना सिर्फ पाकिस्तान से, पूरी दुनिया से बेहतरीन लोगों के साथ, बेहतरीन माइंड्स के साथ कनेक्ट करवाते हैं। पीपल हु हैव डन द जॉब एंड हैव बीन अमेजिंगली सक्सेसफुल एट दैट, हम उनके साथ आपको कनेक्ट करवाते हैं। And this has only been possible due to the government support. We have been supported by 3 different governments, starting from 2016 when it was the PMLN government, then PTI, and then of course today PDM. And as it seems, आगे भी जो government आएगी उनकी भी जो है वो support continue रहेगी. And this is one of those I think very few initiatives जहाँ पे आपको cross border जो है वो across the party support मिल रही हो, which is good to see. But I think we need to do much more than that. हमें clear priorities बनानी है, regulations को कम करना है, थोड़ा सा back step करना है. I think कि अब मुझे ये भी चीज नजर आ रही है कि जितना जितना हम आगे जा रहे हैं NICs के अंदर, गवर्नमेंट पहले बहुत ज्यादा बैक डोर में थी, वो अपने आप को उसमें रखती थी, बैक स्टेज रखती थी, लेकिन अब जो है वो इन्वॉल्वमेंट ज्यादा करने की कोशिश हो रही है, which is not advisable at all because to be honest, this is not government's function to run innovation centers. They just need to fund the right people who can run, who know how to run an innovation center, an incubation center, and that should be it. They don't need to be hands-on about it. So these are the things that I wanted to highlight. Thank you so much once again, and I'll be looking forward to hearing more about this.
Thank you, Mr. Chauhan. You have rightly pointed out that we lack an infrastructure for an investment, energy crisis, and that firstly we need to identify what are the priority sectors for micro enterprises and startups to in order to make the and formulate the policies for this sector. And then undoubtedly, government has showed serious concerns and interest for this sector. But as we see that there has been done a lot, but there's surely a long way to go. So now we'd like to move forward towards Mr. Shahryar Tahir. Sir, could you please share that what do you think are the specific measures that are required to upscale the SMEs in Pakistan for promoting cross-border trade through micro enterprises and startups? If so, why? And if you could please share that what kind of regulatory and policy frameworks are in place, and what are the SAMEDA's contributions to facilitate cross-border trade for micro enterprises and startups? Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Zainab, and thank you, SDPI, for involving SAMEDA in today's discussion. I hope you can all hear me. Am I audible? Right. So I think at this point in time, it's going to be very interesting conversation because we got to hear from the research point of view where FBR and Ministry of Commerce and the NTC issues were discussed, to the academics and the recent study done by the World Bank, to a practical overview by Chauhan Saab. In terms of now, I would like to add another element to this discussion. You must understand that when we are talking about micro enterprises or the micro and small enterprises, it's a huge universe. Pakistan is primarily a SME-driven economy, and by recent estimates, the number of SMEs in Pakistan is more than 5 million. Given that fact, and the canvas or the ecosystem which governs the SME sector is addressed at different levels. So while we see that there is definitely a scope for institutions like NIC, which focus on technology-driven, high-value-added interventions and products and services, there is also a large universe which has SMEs across various other fields. Before we discuss that, I think it's pertinent to mention that in terms of where we are right now, some of it was discussed by Dr. Adil. I think we primarily, the crux of the matter is that we primarily lack innovation and R&D when we're talking about our SME sector in Pakistan. Again, referring to the enterprise survey, which was done by World Bank, the introduction of new products by Pakistan's economy stands at around 3 to 4%, while the South Asian average is 25%, and the world average stands at 35%. It's a dismal picture when we talk about process innovation, new product, and new product to the main market is also a dismal position when we're talking about Pakistan's economy and the business sector. Spending on R&D again remains very low, and that is persistent to a large population of the micro and small and medium enterprises in Pakistan. One of the other areas which was highlighted in the study was the number of days it takes to get clearance from the custom for exports. So the reason why I wanted to bring these two factors together is to identify that there are constraints and there are issues both at the private sector level as well as the regulatory environment that we face. And given the fact that SMETA is part of the government, we all, like the academia and other institutions, are playing their role. And I'll be sharing some of the things that we've done to undertake activities which can promote cross-border trade. Informality in the SME sector, again, a huge challenge for us. But at the same time, it's a catch-22 situation. If they move into the formal sector, there are issues. If they remain informal, again, they are not able to capitalize on a lot of incentives and a lot of opportunities which exist, not only in Pakistan, but also across the border. Now, primarily, we've seen that there has been an influx of micro exports, which has been driven by the e-commerce. And if you would recall that about 3 years back, an e-commerce policy was introduced. One of the key pillars for SMETA in that policy was to train people, and we've been able to partner with different institutions. And on our own, we have taken that activity where we are reaching out to SMEs at the grassroots level. In order to forge partnerships, we have worked with different organizations and institutions that are working in the space. We've done joint training sessions with Facebook. Again, a very important area when it comes to e-commerce is the social media and the social media pages. Then we have reached out to other partners such as Alibaba, and also platforms like Etsy, which promote smaller quantities, handmade products across the globe. One of the things which we have gotten the feedback from the SME sector and from the other end of the spectrum, which is the buyers, is there are very strong concerns around fraudulent activities also. So how do you make sure that the SMEs or the micro enterprises who want to become part of the global value chains or want to sell across the border are genuine? For that, we are working on a registration portal, and this is going to be an activity where we will use this data to certify them, not for any taxation purposes, but specifically to handle and facilitate them on activities which can actually facilitate the cross-border opportunities. One other thing which needs to be addressed is the export readiness when we talk about micro and startups. Now, within the startup, there is a subset which is probably being taken care of, not probably, but is being taken care of by NSE. But we, from our lens, the Small and Medium Enterprise Development Authority, we see that there is an opportunity for other areas which includes value-added activities in the agriculture sector, the agro value chains, as well as material sciences. And a lot of efforts need to be undertaken in those specific areas, and we are undertaking those activities. At the end of the day, it is up to the private sector how they want to take up all the facilitation which is being provided. Information dissemination and information asymmetry remains a problem, but organizations such as ours are now actively pursuing the online platform and digitization activities. One of the things that we've also recently done is partnership with the ITC International Trade Center, and we will be launching a self-taught learning management system which focus on exports. Other than that, another important area that SMEDA is now focusing on is the intellectual property rights and registration of authorized users. You might be aware that we are all very familiar with the case of Basmati rice, which has been discussed for the past 3 years. But we are in touch with the Intellectual Property Organization of Pakistan, and we are now trying to promote various GIs across the SME sector. That itself will, we believe that will give a boost to the exports from Pakistan when it comes to specific key areas within Pakistan. Finally, SMEDA as an institution has worked within the SAARC region. We work with, this is again, it was a donor-driven project where we got a network made of all SAARC member countries. The objective was to identify resources and organizations across the SAARC countries where if there's any handholding to be made, that can be done at a fairly fast pace. So one of the things when we're talking about cross-border is the counterpart organizations or support mechanism which exists. So most of the time when we're talking about any intervention, it is one-sided. So in case SMEDA, if SMEDA or any other institution or SME for that matter would want to have any facilitation or support, would probably rely on one side, which is inside their own country. We in that specific project, we made networks where we are in touch with different institutions as well as different entities across our countries, and that information is available with SMEDA, which also leads us to the point that how actively the SMEs or micro enterprises engage in entrepreneurial activities and are willing to spend time on finding the exact information which is available across various organizations within Pakistan. So I think that a lot of information is available, and it is both the public sector's responsibility to have this information available across Pakistan, but also this responsibility or this effort needs to be taken up by these micro and small enterprises. One other area, finally, which I would want to highlight is the recent barter trade agreement, which has been signed by the Ministry of Commerce where we are now actively pursuing barter trade with Iran, Afghanistan, and Russia. That is also another opportunity which will open much more opportunities for our SME sector in Pakistan. Related to this, I would like to give you an example that we got in touch with the Quetta Chamber, and it was a surprise for us to know that the Pakistani entrepreneurs have actually invested and are running their own manufacturing and processing facilities across the border in Iran, because there is an infrastructure available for them to do their business. Now, for us, in order to enhance our cross-border trade, I think there needs to be infrastructure developed so more people can take opportunity of the exports through our borders, both on the east and west side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for your remarks, and we truly appreciate that Samveda has been working jointly working with different multiple organizations in improving and supporting this particular sector in almost all its form. And surely we need to stress on export readiness of our local producers as well, while we focus on the other aspects of the growth in this regard. For the overall growth and expansion of cross-border trade amongst the micro enterprises and startups. And with this, we come to an end of our first round. And now I'd like to move towards the second round. And second round, I'd like to request all the panelists to please share their top 2 recommendations on this webinar. And also, if all of you can shed some light on the initiatives that have been taken by the government to improve the cross-border trade by digitizing it, and how it can be helpful in reducing the regulatory burden on SMEs and startups. So starting off with Mr. Ahmed Awais Khabar, could you please share your comments on this? Over to you, sir.
Yes, thank you very much. I think I briefly touched upon government policies and interventions. I would just want to talk about a couple of things here. In terms of recommendation, I think the National Tariff Commission may want to institutionalize and increase its interaction with the business community. And that's one. And the second, with regards to tariff rationalization, would be that it has to be in tandem or in synergy with the State Bank and the FPI. You cannot go by policy and let's suppose institution by institution. You have to have that environment. You have developed that ecosystem where every institution that is directly or indirectly related to exporting firms must ensure that they provide relevant facilitation. So 2 things in terms of tariff rationalization. With regards to the export schemes, I think the delays in tax refunds, of course, sales tax refunds, that is something that must be resolved at the earliest, because this really decapitates the ability of any organization, be it a startup or a micro or even a medium to small size enterprise. It has a very, very heavy burden for these organizations to perform. So that would be number one. And secondly, when you are developing or putting in effect the export facilitation scheme for 2021 and doing away with or rather phasing out other existing export facilitation schemes, and the design should be aptly communicated, and feedback must be sought from the private sector before you actually go in and make these different ideas, because we've seen it with the PSW. And now coming to your idea of digitization, you have done some experiments with digitizing, starting from VBOC, and now you have the single window idea. So you have first-hand experience of how digitization has made changes. Yes, it has made changes. How easy is access to such platforms? How cumbersome or complex or straightforward are the operations or the procedures? What was the orientation for the private sector or the industries prior to rolling out PSW or making any such changes? So a holistic, inclusive drive needs to be there before you start digitizing or bring in more and more technology. You have to bear in mind that you have these rural MSMEs also who need to be part of this. So the more technology driven you become, the more you have to reach out to those vulnerable firms and ensure that they have a buy-in and ensure that they understand the procedures and understand the intricacies of these newer and more technology driven platforms. So that will be from my side. Thank you, Zainab.
Thank you, sir. Your interventions have been rightly pointed and noted. Sir, now I'd like to move towards Dr. Adil, please. Could you please share your comments, please?
Thank you, Zainab. Okay, so one of my recommendations, again, we have talked about digitalization of the whole process. So digitalization should come at the firm level as well as the government level, right? So at the firm level, so there's this whole link between manufacturing and services that needs to be capitalized. The thing is, the IT services and all, right? They can play a big role in increasing our exports, even at the firm level. So you can see the digitalization of the production processes. You can see in textile firms, in the more advanced, more high-tech firms, relatively high-tech in the textile sector, they can adopt these practices. They can get computer scientists to do their programming, etc., for the machines that can work more effectively, right? These days is the era of AI, right? So with the era of AI, we need to bring that technology into our industries as well and make them more competitive. One of the biggest things that we see is that there's a loss of competitiveness in our industries. And if you look at your neighbors, they are using technology to overcome that cost. So that is one thing that we need to look at, is how to use the service sector, the IT sector, all the other, even the transportation sector, right, into the more efficiency in logistics and transportation. Because one of the things that we did identify in the SDPI study that I did was that transportation logistics is a big cost, is a burden, especially for the smaller firms. The timeliness of delivery, right, and all that matters. Look at Amazon, how they have evolved their whole production and the warehouse system and all that to ensure that consumers, their customers, get the products on time. This is very important again for at the industry level. Then there's this next step, that's something that I also want to recommend, is that a lot of FTAs, free trade agreements that we sign, they unfortunately don't have, so the ones that Pakistan has signed, right, are kind of outdated in many ways. They don't have the SME provision. All the new ones that we see have this whole chapter with provision on SMEs and how they encourage the development of SMEs in the country, and they actually have created programs, joint programs. So like Korea, I think, has the recent one that it has signed with some of the other countries, has this whole provision on SMEs. EU is a big thing. Like when EU signs its FTAs and all, they do take into account the role of SMEs. Then into this, we also see that, so when it comes to FTAs, right, Pakistan unfortunately is on the back seat in that we haven't signed FTAs since 2007, 2008, when we last signed a major agreement that was with China. We have been very delayed on this, right? We haven't taken much steps since then because we've had a lot of problems, a lot of controversies with the FTA with China. So that even that aside, FTAs can play, so that the non-tariff measures that they introduce, right? So one of the things that comes in is that the quality of goods that we are producing, how do we certify our SMEs to produce the best quality of goods, the conformity that they do, right? So there's this whole focus on this. We in Pakistan, the consumers are not really aware of the quality of goods that SMEs produce, even that sell in the local market, right? We don't know, so we need to differentiate that. So the whole idea of having these formal SMEs, which provide better quality of goods and goods, right, and services as well, that should be recognized by the consumers. The consumers need to be made aware of them. So these certifications, this whole awareness of the consumers, again, the IT sector, etc., can play a big role in that, in reducing those information asymmetries, right? In making sure that consumers know what the producers are selling, and the producers that are investing in their quality and the certifications are able to reach those consumers and make sure that they get the larger market share. So in that sense, that will encourage them to increase not only their market share in the domestic market, but also export, because they'll be able to meet those quality standards that are required in the foreign countries as well. So this whole plays a big role in ensuring that we export effectively and SMEs become an engine of growth, right? That is what we need in this challenging times, right? So thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now I'd like to request Mr. Sayan, if you could please share your comments.
Thank you, Zainab, once again. I truly agree with what Ahmed Saab and Dr. Adil has said. I think these are wonderful points. In addition to those, I think हमें ये भी समझने की जरूरत है what is actually digitalization. So for instance, if we look at what the government is doing right now, or most of the public institutions are doing right now, they would think that if there is a manual process happening, we just transfer it to, say, for example, a website, let it happen digitally, and that is all the digitalization that we need. This is the first step, I would say, but we need to go much beyond that now. I think what digitalization actually offers, and especially with the technology such as AI today, what the true potential of digitalization offers is the business process re-engineering, or the optimization of processes, as we call it. And therefore, I think the public sector needs to look hard at itself and see how the things have been conducted, what are certain flaws in those things, how it has been a limiting factor for the industry, especially the export-oriented industry, and how it needs to be business process. So for example, again, I was in Sydney, and there, if you see the government work, how they work is they hire the best consultants in the world to do the business process re-engineering of different public institutions. I'm not saying you spend the same amount of money, because it's insane the amount of money that they spend on the consulting. But I am pretty sure that if they reach out to the private sector, which is doing the business process re-engineering for their own private institutions, they would be able to help them make their own processes much more efficient. And as Ahmed Saab and Dr. Adil were rightly saying, this happens through constant consultation with the private sector. Without their input, this is not going to ever happen. So this is one step. Then there is के आपके ये जो सारे के सारे public institution हैं, they need to be a part of the community. They cannot exist in the vacuum. Right now, they exist in vacuum. They make policies without input, much input from the right stakeholders. अगर कोई फोटो op के लिए गलती से जो है वो stakeholder involvement करा भी जाती है, तो उनके ऊपर जो सिफारिशात वहाँ पे आती हैं, the recommendations that come, they are not truly included in the actual policy making. वो फिर दोबारा से जब पॉलिसी आती है तो बहुत सारे जो स्टेक होल्डर्स होते हैं वो मायूस हो रहे होते हैं. फॉर इंस्टेंस, जस्ट लुक एट व्हाट हैज हैपेंड इन दिस बजट. Without going much deep into this topic, I think अगर आप उसको देखेंगे तो आपको पता चल जाएगा कि बिजनेस कम्युनिटी ने अपनी मुसलसल मीटिंग्स के अंदर प्राइम मिनिस्टर को, कैबिनेट को, फाइनेंस मिनिस्टर को बहुत सारी जो हैं वो recommendations प्रोवाइड की थी, but those recommendations were never taken to the actual budget that was produced, and therefore the business community now is like flabbergasted कि ये हुआ क्या है, ये निकल के क्या आएगा हमारे पास finally. So this is what has been happening in all the policies. Even मैं जो आपको example दे रहा था, the investor roundtables that have been happening since 2019. Every year there is a investor roundtable happening. It's not just by the NIC in Islamabad. It's all the NICs doing that right now. And every NIC then produces a white paper after that roundtable. And those white papers have recommendations and policy actions that have been agreed upon by different institutions, but they never transform into actual policy making. And finally, when the policies actually come through, इतनी fragmented approach है कि FBR ने एक जो है वो पॉलिसी का ऐलान कर दिया है, बट जो है वो इम्प्लीमेंट किसी और इदारे ने भी उसके साथ करनी थी, उनको पता ही नहीं है कि ये हुई है। मैं मसलन के अभी फिर एग्जांपल दूंगा आपको। There was a big policy, startup policy declared in 2019, and there was a whole feature in like a full page feature in the newspapers around Pakistan कि ये जी नई स्टार्टअप पॉलिसी आई है, उसके अंदर एफबीआर का ये रोल होगा, एससीसीपी का ये रोल होगा, स्टेट बैंक ये करेगा, इतने टैक्स कंसेशंस दिए जाएंगे, इस तरह से जो है वो प्रमोट किया जाएगा एक्सपोर्ट सर्विसेज की। एंड एक्चुअली एक स्टेप भी जो है वो किसी भी इदारे में उसका इम्प्लीमेंट नहीं किया, क्योंकि दे वर अनाउंस्ड बट नेवर एग्जीक्यूटेड और टर्न इनटू पॉलिसी, जहाँ पे वो बिल्कुल रूल लेवल की जो चीज होती है ना, जहाँ पे आपके इदारे जो है वो जाकर उसको इम्प्लीमेंट कर लेते हैं, वो सिर्फ एक ऐलान बन के रह जाता है। उसका लेटर इन स्पिरिट कभी भी ना फायदा उसका जो है वो स्टार्टअप को नहीं पहुंचता, माइक्रो एंटरप्राइजेस को नहीं पहुंचता। अच्छा, फिर क्या होता है, अभी स्टेट बैंक जो है वो ऐलान कर देगा कि हमने फॉर एग्जांपल फ्रीलांसर्स को इजाजत दे दी है कि वो बाहर से जो पैसे मंगवाएंगे उनके ऊपर कोई टैक्स नहीं होगा, गिवन के वो दिखा देंगे हाँ जी ये बाहर से पैसे आ रहे हैं आपके। इसी तरह से आपका जो है वो फ्रीलांसर के लिए अकाउंट खुल जाएगा, जस्ट नीड टू शो के हाँ जी मैं फ्रीलांसर हूँ, वो अपना फाइबर का अकाउंट दिखा दें, किसी का भी अकाउंट दिखा दें। अब ये फिर हो जाते हैं, लेकिन जो एक्चुअल बैंक्स जो कि अकाउंट ओपन कर रहे हैं और जिन्होंने इस पॉलिसी को इम्प्लीमेंट करना है, दे नेवर गेट कम्युनिकेटेड दीज थिंग्स, और वो फिर जो है वो तंग कर रहे होते हैं स्टार्टअप को भी, फ्रीलांसर को भी, कि भाई हमें तो इस तरह की कोई चीज कम्युनिकेट नहीं हुई। एफबीआर ने ऐलान किया कि 3 साल तक आपके ऊपर स्टार्टअप के ऊपर कोई टैक्सेशन नहीं होगी, यू विल नॉट बी चार्ज एनी टैक्स। थोड़े अरसे के बाद जो है वो टैक्स काट के जो है वो उन्होंने देना शुरू कर दिया। उनके जो क्लाइंट्स थे, हमारे स्टार्टअप्स ने उनको रीच आउट किया कि यू कैन नॉट डिडक्ट टैक्स बिकॉज वी आर टैक्स, वो हमें पॉलिसी में है कि आपको टैक्स नहीं अप्लाई होगा। तो मैंने कहा कि आप इसका सर्टिफिकेट ला के दें, क्योंकि हमारे पास एफबीआर की क्लियर डायरेक्शन है कि आपको जिस वक्त तक सर्टिफिकेट नहीं दे दिया जाता टैक्स एग्जेम्पशन का, तब तक आप टैक्स देंगे ही देंगे, हमें कट करना है सोर्स के। तो वो एफबीआर के पास गए और एफबीआर को जाके जब उन्होंने ये बताया तो एफबीआर ने कहा हमारी तो ये पॉलिसी है, एंड सिंस इट इज अ पॉलिसी वी आर नॉट गोइंग टू गिव यू अ लेटर ऑफ एग्जाम्पशन, एंड देयरफॉर वो जो लिम्बो क्रिएट हुआ उसके अंदर द टैक्स वाज बीइंग कट एट द सोर्स। एफबीआर वाज सेइंग कि आप लोग जो है वो टैक्स एग्जेम्प्ट हैं बाय पॉलिसी, एंड इम्प्लीमेंटेशन पे किसी ने गौर नहीं किया, उसका फायदा कोई नहीं। सो दीज आर द थिंग्स मेरे ख्याल में जिनको इस बात से कि हमें पॉइंट स्कोरिंग करनी है, पॉलिटिकल पॉइंट स्कोरिंग करनी है, इस बात से बाहर आए, एक्ट एज अ ग्रुप रादर देन एक्टिंग इन फ्रेगमेंट्स, प्रोसेस को रीथिंक करें, अपनी ऑप्टिमाइजेशन करें, एंड देन जो है वो हमें कोई चीजों का फायदा नजर आएगा, ओनली देन वी कैन बिकम मार्केट कंपेटिटिव एट ग्लोबल लेवल। थैंक यू।
Thank you, sir, for your remarks. Now I'd like to move towards Mr. Shahriyar. If you could, sir, please give your comments on this.
Yeah, I think for the micro enterprises, individually, उनके लिए बहुत मुश्किल है to export. Ideally, as the research suggests that in order for them to become part of the global value chains, I think we need to have a very robust subcontracting mechanisms and subcontracting arrangements in place. I think that is what we've seen in a lot of other countries where these smaller and micro enterprises and startups have actually grown in size and have attained that critical size where they can actually start exporting themselves. So one, my suggestion would be, and SPIDA itself is working on that, is to identify and work on creating more subcontracts within the larger enterprises and startups and micro enterprises. Right now, it's only restricted to a few sectors of the economy, given that we are factory driven. But I think this needs to be expanded to other areas. The other thing which I would recommend is the identification of new opportunities. right now, world across, green productivity, green projects, and circular economy is something that the world is focusing on. And there are different areas within the circular economy that can be captured by micro enterprises. For instance, we are now talking to FAO to work on a recycling and a redeployment of banana fibers, which is right now non-existent. So these kind of opportunities need to be identified and institutionalized for the SMEs and the micros and the startups to take advantage of. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. We're very grateful for your remarks. And with this, we come to an end to our session. But there's a comment in the chat box, Q&A box from Mr. Shamim Akhtar. And he has very rightly stressed about the need of the double coincidence of wants between the buyers and sellers, and also rightly pointed on the need of data availability for the exporters that will be helpful in decision making from the exporters. And obviously, since we lack in this sector, we really need the right and a very right source of data that would be very helpful. Not only in terms of exports, but only obviously it will increase our import competitiveness, the export competitiveness of our exports as well. With this, I'd like to announce if anyone has any questions from the attendees, they may please write in the chat box, or they may feel free to contact me anytime on the given shared email address. I've shared it in the chat box. You may please feel free to contact me and share any of your queries or questions that you might be having, and they will be forwarded to the respective panelists. And to conclude the session today, I'm very thankful to the esteemed panelists for their remarks and policy directions, which indeed has always been helpful in improving the policy agenda of SDPI. And the team has taken notes and will be reverting back with the policy recommendations sought from today's discussion. A policy brief will be extracted and shared with the speakers for the review and inputs. Thank you from you again. Have a good weekend. Goodbye.